Now, turning to our program, please welcome John Franke, partner at Gas Turek LLC, to introduce today's speakers.
Good afternoon. Is this on? It is on. Is it on? Raise your hand if you have heard of fusion voting. Not counting the Rotary announcement for the program today. How many of you have heard of fusion voting? A few. Well, don't feel badly. Most people have not. It hasn't been used, hasn't been allowed in Wisconsin for over a century. And frankly, a year ago, I could not have given you an explanation of what fusion voting is. But we're here today to talk to you about election reform known as fusion voting and a new political organization, United Wisconsin, that wishes to use fusion voting to effectively express the collective voice of its members and to influence candidates and public policy. To my right here today is Dale Schultz, a founder and co-chair of United Wisconsin. Dale was born in Madison, graduated from UW-Madison in 1975, where he played on the Badger men's basketball team. Okay, so that was a time when Wisconsin was not known for basketball. But Dale was also a member of the crew team at a time when, does anyone remember? The Badgers won 3 back-to-back national championships, the third with Dale in 1975. In 1982, at age 29, he was elected as a Republican to the state assembly, and 9 years later to the state senate, where he represented Wisconsin's 17th district, an area just west of the Madison area, and I believe he lived in Richland Center now. And he represented that district for 23 years, serving as the Republican majority leader for the 2005 legislative term. To my left is Craig Gilbert, a sort of retired Washington bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, a longtime political writer. Craig has covered every presidential campaign since 1988, when he was surely too young to vote.
And I'm tired.
Yeah. He has chronicled Wisconsin's role as a national swing state, writing widely about polarization and voting trends. He understands Wisconsin party politics as well as anyone. He currently serves as a fellow at Marquette Law School's Lubar Center and still is featured in the Journal-Sentinel. As an attorney, it has been my privilege to represent United Wisconsin in their recently filed lawsuit asking the Dane County Circuit Court to find that the current statutory ban on fusion voting is unconstitutional. I've had the good fortune to do a lot of really interesting things in my career, but this is surely one of the most interesting. So I'm first going to take a few moments to explain what fusion voting is and why it is against the law in Wisconsin. Then Dale's going to introduce himself to you some more and talk about why he helped create United Wisconsin. And then Craig will moderate a discussion about what the heck this is all about. So I'm going to have to look down there. I don't want to ignore this side of the room, but I need to use the screens, and please pay attention. I'm going to try to explain fusion voting in less than 9 minutes. What is it? It's really quite simple. Fusion voting is an election process that allows more than one political party to nominate the same candidate. A candidate nominated by 2 parties appears on the ballot twice. The candidate with the most votes wins. I know people have a hard time getting their head around this, but that's because we are so used to a routine of one candidate, one party. But fusion voting was widely used in Wisconsin during the first 50 years of our statehood, was used throughout the country, and is still used in a couple of states. And one of those states is New York. And I think the best way to explain fusion voting is to use a New York ballot from the 2020 presidential election. Now, if this looks a little complicated, it's not. It's really less complicated than our Wisconsin ballots look. But as you can see, there are 7 parties listed in the left-hand column, and there are six elections addressed, including the 2020 presidential election. By comparison, the Wisconsin ballot in 2020 had 5 different parties. This has 7, but the difference is that in New York, 2 parties could nominate the same candidate. Now, if we look at the same ballot here, you can see that the Republican and conservative parties nominated Trump and Pence. They did that as a political party, separate nominations. The Democrats and the Working Families, which is a well-known party in New York, we don't have it here, but the Democrats and the Working Family Party nominated Biden and Harris. And that's how the ballot worked for president. You had 2 parties nominating each of the major party candidates. But what's interesting here is that this is Elise Stefanik's congressional district. And as you can see, not 2, but 3 parties fused on the nomination of Elise Stefanik. The Republicans, the Conservatives, and at the bottom there, a party called the Independence Party. You see the Green Party and the Libertarian Party. There we see those on our ballots. They chose not to cross-nominate a candidate. But those other 3 parties all nominated the same people for Congress, for state Senate, for state assembly, and for a New York surrogate judge position. While those alliances may seem intuitively logical, what's really interesting about this ballot is the Conservative Party and the Democrats cross-nominated a candidate for Supreme Court. I don't know who this guy, Rory or Gal, was, but he must have had something going because he won the nominations of the Conservatives and the Democrats. Now, the same kind of competition once happened in Wisconsin. And hopefully some of you know, maybe you all know, that Wisconsin has a particularly rich history of third parties. In the 5 decades after our statehood, we had Free Soilers, we had Grangers, we had anti-Nebraska Democrats, we had a Reform Party, a Greenback Party, a United Labor Party, we had a Farmer Labor Party, we had the Knights of Labor, we had the Anti-Monopoly Party, we had populists, we had a Prohibition Party and an Abolition Party. And these parties influenced the major party candidates and often helped win elections by fusing nominations. Now, it's a colorful and complex history, but let's just talk briefly about the most successful third party that emerged in Wisconsin. This one. They didn't have the logo back in 1854, but this was once a third party using fusion to get its foot in the door. Now, when Wisconsin became a state, the 2 major parties were the Whigs and the Democrats. And both of those parties, in the time of the Wisconsin statehood, were deeply divided on the expansion of slavery into the new territories. Now, we all know about the little schoolhouse in Ripon, where in 1954, citizens gathered together, tired of the ambivalence and waffling of the major parties on the key issues of slavery. And as Alan Bove, one of the organizers of this meeting, said, "We went into our little meeting as Whigs, Free Soilers, and Democrats. We came out of it Republicans." So in the November 1854 election, this new party, the Republicans, used fusion to cross-nominate with Free Soilers and anti-Nebraska Democrats, candidates for all 3 of Wisconsin's congressional seats, and 2 of them won. The Republican Party really never looked back. It went on to become the nation's most successful third-party movement, and it dominated Wisconsin politics for the next 70 years. So, if fusion is a good thing, why is it against the law? Well, because it is a good thing. An effective way to allow voters dissatisfied with the major parties to organize and be heard and to change the political landscape. It's just not a good thing for the party that controls the legislature. Republican dominance of Wisconsin politics after 1854 was remarkable, but the rare times when the Republican control in this state was threatened, it was because of fusion between the moribund Democratic Party and some third-party movement. Between 1856 and the end of the century, there were 14 governors in Wisconsin. Republicans had 12 of them. The only time they lost was 1874, when a new Reform Party fused with the Democrats to elect this happy guy, William Robert Taylor, as governor. Again, in 1890, former Milwaukee Mayor George Wilbur Peck used fusion to win 2 terms as governor. These are the only times the Republicans lost, and this played out at all sorts of other state and local elections. And then in 1896, the Democrats and the populists cross-nominated William Jennings Bryant for president, and then they cross-nominated candidates for all statewide offices. So enough was enough. In 1897, the Wisconsin legislature passed Act 348, which banned fusion voting, which required that once one party had nominated someone, that was it. There could not be 2 parties nominating the same person. And Wisconsin was not alone during the 1890s. Throughout the north part of our country, dominant Republican parties were challenged by fusion between Democrats and various emerging populist parties. And the legislatures in those states did just what the Wisconsin Republicans did. They banned fusion. In the South, it was the dominant Democrats, the Jim Crow Democrats, who opposed fusion because they were facing challenges from a minority Republican Party that fused with various new populist groups. So that is why United Wisconsin was formed. And that is why United Wisconsin has brought a lawsuit asking the Dane County Court to find that the fusion ban is an unreasonable and unnecessary restriction on critical constitutional rights guaranteed by the Wisconsin Constitution. These include freedom of speech. There's really no speech more important than the statement we make when we cast our ballots. We should have the right to speak out for a candidate without having to support a party we do not choose to support. Freedom of association. No associations, no constitutionally protected associations are more important than the groups we form for the purpose of expressing ourselves politically and influencing public policies. The government must have a compelling reason to limit those freedoms, and our lawsuit contends that there is no compelling reason. We've also relied on the Equal Protection Clause because fusion voting was enacted to protect the party in power from fair competition and continues to serve that purpose. It unlawfully cements into our statutes a political duopoly under which only 2 parties have a reasonable chance of success. And it uniquely limits the expression of minor and newer political parties and of the citizens whose interests those parties represent. Dale formed a party, United Wisconsin, wants to use fusion voting to advance the interests of that party. And I'm now going to let him say a few words about himself and why he helped found United Wisconsin.
Well, I'm going to try to keep this to a very few words because I know the most interesting part of today's program is going to be led by Craig Gilbert, who's going to be interviewing us, and then, of course, your questions. And I want to begin by saying thank you for caring for your participation in Rotary and all the wonderful things that you do for this great and grand community of our state. I know that like many places in Wisconsin, there's a lot of anxiety and frustration and needs. But I believe that you're up to the challenge, and being able to share a podium with 2 distinguished Milwaukeeans is a great honor. I have had the chance to be down here before as majority leader listing and working with community leaders. I enjoyed that very much. And I enjoyed very much being able to be down here and sharing my ideas. Let me just say that you probably, those of you who haven't heard of me, there's a reason for that. I come from southwestern Wisconsin, and there aren't a lot of Journal Sentinels sold over there, and we don't get WTMJ. And for a long time, talk radio in Milwaukee had no impact in southwestern Wisconsin, and my colleagues found that wonderful because they thought there's a guy who can do what he thinks is right rather than responding to the latest message of the day. I hoped that we would be more successful in the long run, but my colleagues were very kind to me, and I appreciated that. And I also appreciated the relationship that I had with the Democrats in this area and my counterpart in the minority, Senator Judy Robson. We tried to represent all the people and give everyone a voice, and I look back on those days fondly. I have a question too. How many people here think the current political process serves you or this community well? Yeah, I beat you on that one. Nobody's putting their hand up. Do you know that increasingly, and Charles Franklin probably could point this out more accurately than I, but increasingly we have more and more people saying their interests aren't served by either of the major political parties at all. And I would submit that that's by design because they don't want anybody else participating. They own the process. They don't have to come up with any ideas or be responsible. And stop and think about it. Have we seen a lot come out of Washington, D.C. lately that is meeting the challenges this country is facing? Have we seen a lot come out of Madison that meets the needs of the city of Milwaukee or Milwaukee County and its infrastructure needs, its desire to do something about mental health and education? I haven't seen a lot, maybe you have. And I got into politics for a reason. I got into politics because I thought we could do better. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to solve problems, and my guess is that's a lot of the same reasons you're Rotarians and you have an interest in this topic. Well, the question is, how are we going to get to a place where we can empower more people and break up this duopoly? And the answer is two things: fusion voting and United Wisconsin. Now, we have to change the law first, and that was mentioned in the, by John about the lawsuit. But assuming we are successful, we are prepared to move forward and incorporate a political party. Our tenants, have laid out for introduction purposes to reinforce the things that we all appreciate and love about Wisconsin: a clean environment, a University of Wisconsin system and a public education system that's great, and clean government. And our whole idea is that we want to get back to those things because that were the best days in Wisconsin, when we were all working together to solve problems. The state was growing and prosperous. And so we are prepared to work with people and to get that done. Let me just say that this will work, I believe, because we're going to empower people, we're going to give them agency. By being able to sway only 2-3% of the voting population, we can determine the winners. Think about our last few elections. They've been very, very close. And if we have a system where a determined group of people who know that they can fuse with one of the major parties and go out and form their own political party, of course in our case it'd be United Wisconsin, that we would be in a position to negotiate with those people for real change. And I find that exciting. I know a lot of people do, and we hope by the time we finish today, we've got you a little bit more than excited.
All right, let's turn this over to Craig Gilbert.
Thank you, John. Good evening, good afternoon, everybody. So you do hear a variety of arguments and rationales for fusion voting. We've just heard some. The idea that it will empower third parties and kind of break up the two-party duopoly, the idea that it will give voters kind of just more options and more choice and more agency, the idea that it could incentivize moderation, and the idea that it will fix something that's often referred to as vote splitting, which is the problem of multi-candidate elections which fragment the vote and result in a candidate winning without a majority of the vote in an election with 35, 40, 45, 48% of the vote. If you had to choose one of those, because not all of those arguments are, in sync with each other, and they're often debated in different ways, but if you had to choose one, what would it be?
Well, I think that the fact that you can get to a majority is the best reason to have fusion voting. Because right now, think about our elections. We sit around and argue about the fact that, well, I won the election, I had more votes than ever before, but no, you didn't get a majority. And it allows everybody to sort of claim their own mandate. Fusion voting allows you to actually get to a majority, and it allows that fraction of voters who help push it to a majority to sit down at the table and negotiate prior to an election and after an election with the people who win. And of course, if those people who win don't, well, you're not likely going to support them the next time around. So I think there'll be a natural movement in that direction.
Well, to me, the most compelling argument for fusion voting is the simple fact that consistently, roughly the same number of people identify as a Democrat or Republican or as an independent. It roughly breaks down into thirds. This is from a recent Pew study. It's a national study, and so it has other 15% there. But I see fusion voting as attending to the interests, the political interests of that 43% who do not identify with one of the major parties. And I think you have to ask yourself, why should that 43% be relegated to pulling the lever for a party they do not wish to support, or wasting their vote on a third-party candidate that has no chance to win, and who is almost certainly going to be a spoiler. I mean, that's what we've seen with third parties, whether it was back with Ralph Nader or all the other third-party movements we've seen. The people who support those candidates end up saying, all I did was take votes away from the major party candidate that I would have most preferred. That's the spoiler effect. That's what third parties get to do in our system. And the goal here is to change that and allow them to link up with major parties, bring those candidates towards their views in a way that will allow them to express their real political interests.
But does it necessarily follow that allowing candidates to appear on more than one line on the ballot is going to sort of pull the major parties toward the center? Because you can imagine a situation where a major party might, as a result of creating a coalition with a party further from the center, might push its own politics in that direction, because a lot of minor parties are on the fringes.
It's kind of hard to believe that the major political parties could get any further out on the fringe that they're where they are right now. I think the advantage is encouraging people who have an interest in issues, whether it's the environment or education or what have you, to get out and to get organized and to make a coherent policy that they'd like to see advanced in the future, rather than what they're treated to, which is a state and national cheap version of the Jerry Springer show for government. What we need are people who are advancing ideas. And this would allow small groups of people to begin that process, to interview the major political parties or other political parties, fuse their votes together, and initiate real change. It gives them agency, it gives them power. And that's what I think, this is all about. And now, there's one thing I'm going to take a little leave here and say, there's something that we haven't covered, and that is fusion voting wasn't missed right away. And the reason for it is you had liberal and conservative Republicans, liberal and conservative Democrats, and people were used to being independent. That was sort of our frontier ethos. And they would get together and be independent. Independence was highly prized. Well, as time went on, the moneyed interests or other interests that were having huge influence on our political process began the sorting process in governmental bodies, and they got rid of those kind of people. And, you know, you look in Washington, D.C., you know, nobody challenges the status quo because the power that the majority of the majority or the majority of the minority has, so people just do what they're told. Well, that never was me to begin with, and so I find this very encouraging. I talk to a lot of people. There are a lot of good ideas out there, and I want to do everything I can to get people excited and to bring those ideas forward because we need a lot of solutions.
Yeah, I mean, some of the problems you were alluding to in our political culture, which we're all obviously very unhappy with, are the result of many forces, right? I mean, the decline of ticket splitting, the degree of polarization, the degree of animus toward people in the other party, the decline of play in the electorate and swing voters. I mean, those are the divides along geographic lines and education lines that are getting wider. There is a lot behind that. And so I guess one question is, can tweaks in the political system be powerful enough to remedy, you know, deep problems in our political culture?
Yes. Now, is that the sole answer? There's a lot of election reform talk out there, and fusion voting is one of them. Is fusion voting going to immediately change our political culture? Is it going to have an effect on what just happened in Minnesota? No, not right away. But change takes time, and what United Wisconsin wants to do is use the fusion nomination process to get bipartisanship and get a moderation in our current political dialogue. And the hope certainly is it's the kind of thing that might change the culture in a way that moves us away from where we are now.
You know, more and more it seems modern politics is not voting for something or some idea. It's really voting against something or someone. And it's hard for me and a lot of people I talk to out in Richland Center at the coffee shop to see how that benefits anybody. And if you should happen to engage a young person in a conversation about politics, they would say, well, if that's democracy, count me out, because I don't see how it meets my needs. What they want is a seat at the table. They want to have real agency where they get to help craft the solutions. They don't have to have everything going their way, but they want to know they're being listened to. And I think we get there with fusion voting because it provides more voters, more choices. It challenges the two-party duopoly, and it eliminates that problem of wasted votes where people are trying to have their voice heard, but they can't make a difference.
So just one more little historical digression. I had heard of fusion voting because I grew up in the suburbs of New York, and it's always been a big feature of New York elections. So I went back and looked at 40 years of U.S. Senate elections in New York, starting in the late 60s to the late 2000s, and that's 14 Senate elections. And here's a little flavor for how those elections looked when it came to the ballot. Jacob Javits won the U.S. Senate race in New York in 1968 and 1974 on the Republican and liberal lines. James Buckley won in 1970 on the conservative and independent lines. Pat Moynihan won in 1976, 1982, a campaign I actually worked on, and 1994 on the Democratic and liberal lines, and he won in 1988 on just the Democratic line. Al D'Amato won 3 elections on the Republican, conservative, and right to life lines. Chuck Schumer won in 1998 on the Democratic, independent, and liberal lines, and then he won 6 years later on the Democratic, independent, and working family lines. And Hillary Clinton won in 2000 on the Democratic, working family, and liberal lines, and then 6 years later on the Democratic, independent, and working family lines. So that's 14 Senate elections, 8 different winning coalitions. Only once in those 14 elections did the winning candidate appear on only one line on the ballot. So it did empower, it did empower in that period when New York was a more competitive state than it is now. It did empower third parties. It did not always result in a majority victory. James Buckley got elected to the Senate with 39% in 1970, and others got elected with less than 50%. And it didn't necessarily mean that the winner needed the votes of a third party to win, but it's a pretty colorful and diverse election history, and I just wondered what you take away from that.
The people I work with often like to promote the notion that fusion voting can make a difference. And I don't think that should be the major test. To me, the major test is, the question is giving people a right to vote for a candidate, to try to influence a candidate without having to pull a party lever that they don't want to support. Now, a candidate doesn't have to accept the nomination of any party, but people should have the right to do that, whether they succeed or not. But
I think we have a word for that called freedom.
To take off on Craig's point, can it make a difference? Well, these are the national, the same kind of things Craig was just referring to. In 1940, as you can see, the Republican votes for Willkie would have beaten the Democratic votes for a guy named Franklin Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. But fusion with another party made the difference. Now, Craig asked before, does that have any effect? It's hard for me not to believe that that other party out there trying to influence the election doesn't move a candidate in one way or another who needs that 7% to get over the top. In 1944, we had Dewey, Republicans beating Roosevelt in terms of the Democratic vote, but he fused with 2 parties. And with the help of those 2 fused parties, got over the top. Kennedy in 1960 was in a dead heat with Nixon, but for his support from a third party. 1980 was interesting because John Anderson ran as an independent, but Ronald Reagan got over the top of Carter in New York. These are all New York where it's allowed with the help of fusion. So it does make a difference, and it does push candidates to say, I need to listen to what that group wants. I need to listen to what United Wisconsin wants because I want those votes, and in these instances, they needed those votes.
Let's imagine for a second this community. I have some familiarity with it, but I'm certainly no expert. But I learned over here during my time in the legislature that education from time to time gets to be a hot topic. And a lot of people still aren't happy with their choices and where things are at. Can you imagine if you came up with, like New York, a working families party, and one of the center tenets had to do with education? And people got really excited about it and went out and organized a political party and then started interviewing both the major political parties, their for statewide offices particularly. Where are you at on this? We want to know. And we're prepared to fuse with you if you'll have us. Of course, you can't force anybody to do anything like that, but you can ask them. And if we're successful together, yeah, we'll come back and we will want to sit at the table and negotiate with you. Boy, doesn't that change your outlook on the future and where we might be at with education in Milwaukee? Mental health, I know, is a major issue here because of the trauma that a lot of kids have been put through. The environment is a hot issue, and from time to time has excited people in this community, lead pipes and other things. This gives people who have ideas and who want to make change power. It puts them at the table. They don't have to be sat in the corner, patted on the head, and then watch as the power brokers go out and put forth an agenda that has nothing to do with the things they're interested in. Like I said, young people are looking for change and an opportunity to participate. Fusion voting will give them that chance. And it doesn't have to be United Wisconsin. Both political parts of the spectrum can be involved. People of all different kinds of issues can be involved. It just gives us freedom the opportunity to get together with our neighbors, as my friend here pointed out, as a lawyer in charge of our lawsuit. And I think, to me, that is tremendously compelling.
One more? Yeah, so one of huge obstacles obviously face efforts to reform the political system. If it's a reform that one party thinks is good for that party, it's reflexively and automatically opposed by the other party. And here you're proposing reform that neither party really likes very much, but you're doing it through the courts, and you're not depending on buy-in from the two major political parties. Is that the only way you think significant political reform can be achieved in today's politics?
Well, I think it isn't the only way. Things could continue to degenerate in our society to the point where people take to the streets to change things. And we came pretty close to that this last weekend, didn't we? I don't like the violence that I see, and that shouldn't be the only way you can get change. Being able to work with people, to have them exercise their rights given to them by our national and state constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and civil discourse is the way to get there. But the process has to allow that to happen. And so, yeah, we need a lawsuit. And I certainly hope that we're going to be successful.
We would certainly welcome the legislature accepting the introduction of a bill to restore fusion voting. Chris Andrews, who's here, is the executive director and can go to work on that. But as a practical matter, we do not think it is likely that this legislature has any chance of passing this kind of election reform. And for reasons I talked about, and even when another party comes into power, and the Democrats have held the majority from time to time in Wisconsin, they have no incentive to change the law to allow the kind of competition that could be their undoing. They don't want to face that competition. And so the party in power is not going to change the law. And if it is, as we contend, unconstitutional, then it's the courts that have to make the change.
My late friend Bill Krause used to say the status quo exists because a lot of people like it that way. I would submit all the gang that's in Madison and Washington, D.C. like it that they're there. They don't have any incentive to change. Nobody's holding them accountable and forcing them out. It's all re-election is almost automatic. The only people who are unhappy are that 43% that are going, wait a minute, how about us? We don't like either of the choices that we're handed.
So I think it's time to go to questions from our audience.
All right, thank you so much.
So many people sit out from voting and don't even participate in the process. And the other outlier is money and the influence of money. How will fusion voting counter the investment in the massive infusion of money that's making a difference in our politics today?
That's a tough one. I'm going to let you handle that. I'm not sure anything can counter the amount of money we're seeing in politics. But if anyone can figure it out, Dale can.
You know, if we got a group of people together who said the biggest problem in government these days is the obscene amount of money that's pouring into the process, dark money, and where people aren't held accountable for the things they do. If we got a bunch of people excited about that, and believe me, they're out there, because when Tim Cullen and I went around the state promoting the idea of another crazy idea that people said won't happen, gerrymandering reform, I ran into these move to amend people, and they're passionate. Give them a chance to sit at the table and make a difference at an election. We might be able to do something, maybe not McCain-Feingold, but there'd be a chance to do something like that again. And so I think there is a chance to deal with money in politics, but I don't think people with power ever give it up easily, and that means we have to be thoughtful and intelligent and have good ideas.
Thank you. Beth Heller. My question is about if you've compared the fusion approach to what we learned about not too long ago, which is ranked voting, in terms of bringing people together and the impact and empowering, empowering people that might not be as excited about the major parties. Have you looked at that, the impact of fusion compared to ranked voting?
Ranked voting.
Yeah. I've looked at ranked choice voting before, and we've talked about it as a group. Look, I don't see them as necessarily being in competition with one another. I just don't see where anything about ranked choice voting gets people excited. When most people I know who get excited are excited, they get excited around an issue or a chance to change something. I don't see that same allure with ranked choice voting, but I don't see it as necessarily competition either, and I have nothing but the best wishes for those people who are involved in that. There's been a lot of good work that's gone into it, and it'll be interesting to see how well it works in those states where it's recently worked again in the upcoming elections.
One of the things that ranked choice voting addresses, I think, is the whole primary system we have, and raises the question: why is our government sponsoring a system that's designed to help two private enterprises? Political parties are private enterprises, and we have a law structured to allow them to have their primary. We open it up to everybody, but it's their show. And ranked choice voting gets at that notion of maybe there's a different way to do primaries, and they could work together. But part of the goal here is to allow people to form groups like United Wisconsin, affect candidates, bring candidates toward the middle or toward wherever you want to bring those candidates. And that could work with ranked choice voting, but it could work without it.
I think there are people that support ranked choice voting that argue it would be more impactful than fusion voting. I mean, that's a debate that people have. I do think it does come at a cost, which is complexity and also the time it takes to actually administer or process the election results after an election, because you're going through waves of second choice and third choice and factoring those in to the final result. And so, those are some of the, trade-offs in ranked choice voting.
Hello, thank you for being here, Dan Nelson. Given that fusion voting was pervasive here and is still being used in other places, is there any evidence that the winning candidates actually changed their policies based on the coalitions that were formed to get them elected?
All I can offer you is anecdotal information that I have gleaned from talking to people from New York, and their answer is yes. Now look, if I take my new political party with Dave Mahoney, United Wisconsin, and sit down with the winning party in an election, and realize that what we were able to do is turn 5 or 6% of the vote, do I think I'm going to get an equal share of decision-making power with the majority of that party? Probably not. But do I realize how critical I am? Yeah, I'm going to push the envelope as much as I can. And so I think that that there is a good chance that you can do a fair amount of steering.
I'm not aware of a recent study or whether there's a study on how it plays out. Common sense tells me that it does make a difference. But historical writers have written extensively about the use of fusion voting throughout the country up until it was banned in most places, and documented just how powerful it was in terms of taking whoever the major parties were at the time and moving them to a position that satisfied the political interests of that minor party, that niche party, that third party group.
I think it's kind of untested because a lot of the history is confined to a few states, and that it's history, so it's history of a different kind of political landscape than we have today. And it's also, when you're talking about, for example, New York and Connecticut, they're blue states, they're not purple states. Wisconsin would be a really interesting test because it's a 50-50 state. And so it will be a different kind of test to see whether that has an impact on all the things we're talking about.
It's often said nothing breeds success like success. If all of a sudden people began to feel empowered and get excited and get involved, maybe states that weren't quite so close would begin to experiment with this, and we might have a very different political process, one that's exciting, one that's involving people, one that's focused on coming up with solutions that a majority of our citizenry can buy into. And certainly that's in sharp contrast to some of the things that we see now that I can't be proud of, and I know fewer and fewer people in this country are proud of.
This is a question for any one of the panel members, and I appreciate mentioning of Tim Cullen and Bill Krause, worship the ground they walk on. For any one of you, I would argue we're more of a blue state than a purple state these days. Look at the DPI and Supreme Court races. Given that fact, and given what you talked about earlier, about education being a key issue, realizing you're playing the long game on the court case, what might be the impact of Milwaukee or any other location organizing around one issue like education or reading, et cetera, to get the attention of Madison as it relates to fiscal, regulatory, and other issues? Just the threat of fusion voting as opposed to actually implementing it.
Well, I don't think that it really matters the threat across the state. All you have to do is upset the apple cart. You got a United States Senate race coming up. You got a gubernatorial race coming up. Any community that gets excited about a set of issues and can increase the turnout, get people fired up about things and communicating their issues to the candidates, is in a position to really steer an election. And the threat, yeah, might be motivating to some people, but nowhere near like, telling a single mom that she can be involved in a movement that can help her kids have clean drinking water, no lead, where she doesn't have to worry about her kids going off to school. Those are the kinds of problems that people are crying out for solutions around. And I think we're long past due giving the people of this state and this country those opportunities.
This gets back to the primary system where, sure, groups now can form without fusion and try to influence elections. They do it all the time. They can raise money. They can try to express themselves in the process. But we know how the primary system works now as opposed to decades ago. And it's a system that's going to produce someone who has to appeal to the party base or even the party extreme to get through the primary. And organizing and groups, I don't think are going to change that. And the threat of fusion, I don't think is going to change it. The reality of fusion, when someone can say, I have a group, we have a group, here's what we're interested in, tell us why we should support you, that I think will make a difference.
Well, it's a little off topic, but I'm just going to push back on the idea that Wisconsin is a blue state. I mean, 5 of the last 7 presidential elections were decided by less than a point, and our esteemed pollster Charles Franklin can tell us from his data that Wisconsin has actually shifted in a Republican direction during the more than a decade where he's been polling, when Democrats once had an advantage in party ID and now Republicans have the advantage. But again, because we're so purple, I think it really sets up a very tantalizing question around any kind of political reform, because it takes so little to move the needle and tip an election from one side to the other when we're, always sitting there on the 50-yard line.
My name's Kathleen Clark. I'm involved in Voters First Wisconsin and the initiative to reform our primary process using Final 5, which on the basis of 5 people moving to the general election is not too complex, and every software system in our state and across the nation is able to automatically tally, and if people just choose to vote for one candidate, they still can. I want to applaud you for your efforts, because I believe we need reform across the voting spectrum, both in the primaries, to get dark money out of the process and enable people to have a broader choice in that. And then the use of fusion voting in a general election could enhance that. We need change, and we've got younger people who are sitting on the sidelines because they feel that their one vote doesn't matter. So thank you for your efforts. Just a couple of corrections there on both complexity and that it would take a long time to tally. Thank you very much.
I don't accept the criticism of ranked choice voting or final five voting as being too complex, but that is one of the criticisms or what you hear about fusion voting. It's too complex, and it's simply not. The voters in Wisconsin for 50 years figured it out, and they had no trouble with it. In 1896, they had a ballot with all that fusion on it, and if they could do it in 1896, I think we can do it today. And if New Yorkers can do it without confusion and without instability and without riots in the streets, if New Yorkers can do it, and Connecticut people can do it, I think Wisconsin can do it.
Noting the time, I just want to say those are outstanding questions. And for anybody who's a part of the reform movement for elections, we're allies, first and foremost. And I think we all have a better chance if we work together. We're going to be done here shortly, and I would be remiss if I didn't point out that on your table there are a bunch of cards. You don't have to join anything, but if you're interested in more information or how to get a hold of us, it's there, it's yours, take it with you.